The wind howling through the North Broadway district didn't just carry snow. It carried a bitter, unforgiving ice that seemed to freeze the very air in midair. It was the worst blizzard the city had seen in over a decade. The streets below were completely deserted, buried under heavy white drifts that had long since erased the tire tracks of the last brave drivers. The city had gone entirely quiet, wrapped in a suffocating, frozen shroud. But high up on the hill, looking down on the freezing city like a distant king, stood Vance Crest Manor. Inside the mansion, the world was entirely different. The air was thick with the scent of polished mahogany, expensive leather, and the faint, rich aroma of freshly brewed premium coffee. The floors were made of heated marble, keeping the bitter winter chill completely at bay. Towering floor-to-ceiling windows lined the grand study, offering a panoramic view of the storm outside, but the thick, triple-paned glass muted the roaring wind to a distant, powerless whisper. Julian Vance stood by the glass, his fingers wrapped around a warm porcelain mug. To the rest of the world, Julian was a titan. He was a billionaire real estate developer and corporate strategist who had spent his entire life building an empire out of concrete and cold calculations. He was known in the boardroom as a man who never let emotion dictate a decision. To Julian, numbers didn't lie, and vulnerability was simply a weakness that competitors could exploit. He had spent his 20s and 30s sacrificing everything, relationships, friendships, peace of mind, to build this massive fortress on the hill. Now, in his early 40s, he had achieved everything he had ever set out to accomplish. He had more wealth than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. He had a home that people stopped to take photos of from the edge of the property line. Yet, as he stared out into the swirling white void of the storm, an unfamiliar, heavy silence pressed against his chest. The house didn't feel like a home. It felt like a massive, beautifully decorated vault. A vault where he had locked himself inside, completely alone. He sighed, the steam from his coffee momentarily fogging the pristine glass. He rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar ache of exhaustion that a full night's sleep never seemed to fix. He was just about to reach for the heavy, velvet drapes to pull them shut, to completely block out the sight of the freezing, miserable world outside, when something caught his eye. Down at the very edge of his long, winding driveway, past the rows of snow-covered pine trees, stood the massive wrought iron security gates. Under the intense glare of the high-voltage security spotlights, Julian saw a shadow. He blinked, leaning closer to the window. In this weather, nothing living should have been out there. The local government had issued a strict state of emergency hours ago, ordering everyone to stay indoors. But as the wind cleared a path through the blinding snow, for a split second, the shadow moved. It was tiny, far too tiny to be a security guard or a stranded driver walking up the hill for help. Julian's brow furrowed. His security instincts, honed by years of protecting his privacy and wealth, instantly kicked in. He turned away from the window and walked over to the sleek, high-definition security console built into the mahogany desk. He tapped the glowing screen, bringing up the live feed from camera 4, the camera positioned directly over the intercom at the main gate. What he saw on the monitor made his breath catch in his throat. Standing directly beneath the camera, shivering so violently that her entire body was a blur on the digital screen, was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 6 or 7. She wore a winter jacket that was clearly 3 sizes too big for her small frame, the sleeves completely covering her hands. The hood had fallen back, exposing her face to the biting, frozen wind. Her hair was dusted with heavy white snow, and her small face was pale, her cheeks and nose a stark, painful red from the advanced stages of frostbite. In her arms, she was clutching a thick, heavy adult winter coat, holding onto it as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. But curiously, she wasn't wearing it. She was just holding it, hugging it tightly against her chest. Julian stared at the screen, completely stunned. For a man who always knew exactly what to do, who always had a calculated response to any crisis, his mind went completely blank. Who was this child? Were her parents? How on earth had a little girl ended up at the gates of a private estate miles away from the nearest residential neighborhood, in the middle of a historic blizzard. Suddenly, the intercom speaker on Julian's desk buzzed. The sound was sharp, cutting through the quiet luxury of the study. Julian hesitated for a fraction of a second. His hand hovered over the console. Every rule of security he had ever established dictated that he should call the local authorities or his private security team to handle it. A billionaire didn't just open his gates to strangers in the middle of the night. But as he looked back at the screen and saw the little girl collapse slightly to her knees into a deep snowdrift, before forcing herself back up with pure, desperate willpower, Julian hit the talk button. Who was out there? Julian's voice echoed through the gate intercom, sounding deep, authoritative, and deliberately calm. The little girl flinched at the sound of the speaker, her wide, terrified eyes looking around frantically before finally locking onto the camera lens above her head. She took a ragged, trembling breath. When she spoke, her voice was barely louder than a whisper, distorted by the static of the microphone and the roaring wind, but the words cut through the warmth of Julian's study like a knife. "Sir, can I sleep here tonight?" The hesitation in her voice, the sheer desperation wrapped in childhood innocence, hit Julian like a physical blow. He froze. "Who are you?" Julian asked, his voice softening just a fraction, though he tried to maintain his distant composure. "Why are you standing outside my gate in the middle of a snowstorm? Where are your parents?" The little girl looked straight into the camera lens, her bottom lip trembling so hard she could barely form the words. "My name is Maya," she sobbed, her voice breaking as a fresh gust of wind threw a wave of snow directly into her face. I got lost, sir. I was trying to find my mom." Julian frowned, leaning closer to the monitor. "You got lost up here?" "Maya, there are no houses for miles." "Where does your mother work?" "She works at the factory," Maya said quickly, her small voice pleading. "The Apex manufacturing plant, on the North Broadway district side. I went there to find her, sir." Julian knew the place immediately. Apex Manufacturing was a massive, old-school industrial assembly facility located on the lower, working-class edge of the district. It was a brutal place to work, known for employing hundreds of underpaid contract laborers who worked grueling overnight shifts. But that factory was nearly 2.5 miles down the mountain from Vance Crest Manor. "You walked all the way from the Apex plant in this weather?" Julian asked, disbelief washing over him. "No, sir." Maya shook her head quickly, her small frame swaying slightly from exhaustion. "I went there to find her because she forgot something important." Julian looked at the massive, heavy adult coat Maya was still clutching tightly in her arms. "Is that her coat?" "Yes, sir," Maya whispered, hugging the fabric closer to her chest. "She left for her night shift so fast, and she forgot her heavy coat. It's so cold tonight, sir. I knew she would be freezing inside the factory. So I took it and walked out to give it to her. But when I got to the gate, the big security man said the power went out at the main building." Julian listened intently, his analytical mind tracking the details. A power outage at an industrial plant during a blizzard meant total chaos. The man said they had to move all the workers to the old backup building down the road. Maya continued, a tear freezing instantly on her reddened cheek. "He pointed down the street and told me to keep walking that way. But the snow was so thick, sir. I couldn't see the signs. I kept walking and walking, and then the lights went out on the streets. I got so scared, and I just kept walking up the hill until I saw your bright lights." Julian looked at the screen, analyzing her story. It was a flawless, heartbreaking chain of events. An innocent child trying to do a beautiful, selfless thing for her hard-working mother, completely failed by a careless security guard and a brutal storm. Julian pointedly glanced at her attire on the monitor. "Maya, if you have your mother's thick coat right there in your arms, why aren't you wearing it? That coat would keep you warm." Maya shook her head immediately, her voice carrying a fierce, stubborn protectiveness that left Julian completely speechless. "I can't wear it, sir. It's my mom's. If I wear it in the deep snow, it will get wet and dirty. Then she won't have a dry coat when she finishes her shift. I have to keep it clean for her." The answer hung heavily in the quiet air of the mansion's study. Julian stared at the little girl. In his world, people only did things if there was a return on investment. People looked out for themselves first. Yet here was a shivering, freezing child, standing on the brink of hypothermia, refusing to wear a warm coat because she was entirely focused on preserving it for her mother. It was an act of pure, unadulterated love, a concept that Julian hadn't encountered in a very long time. He looked down at his warm coffee, then back at the monitor. He saw Maya's small hands, bright red and raw, clutching the fabric. She was running out of time. If she stayed out there for another 15 minutes, she wouldn't survive the night. Every corporate instinct told him to stay inside, to call the city services, to let someone else handle the liability. But for the first time in his life, the billionaire couldn't just look away. He couldn't press the button to turn off the screen. Julian stood up from his desk, abandoning his warm coffee. He walked out of the study, his footsteps echoing sharply against the grand marble staircase as he hurried toward the front foyer. "Arthur," Julian called out, his voice sharp and urgent. An elderly man with perfectly combed gray hair and a neat, professional posture appeared from the shadows of a lower hallway. It was Arthur, Julian's longtime personal assistant and the estate's estate manager. Arthur had been with Julian for 15 years, acting as the quiet, steady anchor of the massive house. "Yes, Mr. Vance?" Arthur asked, recognizing the rare tone of urgency in his employer's voice. "Grab some heavy blankets and turn on the heating in the mudroom immediately," Julian ordered, pulling a thick cashmere overcoat off the rack near the door. "There's a child at the front gate." Arthur's eyes widened in sheer surprise, a look that rarely crossed the old man's face. "A child, sir? In this storm?" "Don't ask questions yet. Just get the blankets," Julian said, his hand already on the heavy brass handle of the front door. "I'm going down to get her." Julian stepped out into the brutal elements. The wind instantly slammed into him, tearing at his coat and forcing him to squint against the blinding, driving snow. The cold was a physical weight, dropping the temperature into the negative digits. Even in his premium, protective winter gear, the chill bit into his skin within seconds. As he walked down the long, sweeping driveway, his boots sinking deep into the unplowed snow, he realized just how terrifying this environment must be for a 6-year-old girl. The trees groaned under the weight of the ice, sounding like snapping bones in the dark. Finally, he reached the massive iron gates. On the other side, huddled into a small ball against the stone pillar, was Maya. She had stopped crying. Her eyes were half closed, her body slipping into the dangerous, sleepy state that comes with severe hypothermia. Julian pulled out his remote, and with a heavy, mechanical groan, the massive iron gates of Vance Crest Manor began to slide open. Maya didn't even have the strength to look up at first. Julian rushed forward, dropping to his knees directly into the freezing snow in front of her. He didn't care about his expensive clothes or his dignity. He reached out, his large hands gently grabbing her trembling shoulders. "Maya," Julian said loudly over the roar of the wind. "Maya, look at me. I'm opening the gate. Come inside." The little girl slowly lifted her heavy eyelids, her gaze unfocused as she looked at the tall, imposing man standing over her. She didn't look at his wealth or his expensive coat. She just saw someone who had finally opened the door. Without a word, she collapsed forward, completely exhausted, her small head resting against Julian's chest. Even as her body went limp, her small, freezing fingers remained tightly locked around her mother's heavy winter coat. Julian didn't hesitate. He gathered the little girl into his arms, lifting her light frame effortlessly against his chest. As he stood up and turned back toward the warm lights of the mansion, he felt a strange, terrifying weight in his arms. He had spent his entire life carrying the weight of a multi-billion-dollar empire. But as he carried this shivering, forgotten child out of the storm, he realized he had never carried anything half as important. The heavy mahogany front door of Vance Crest Manor slammed shut, instantly cutting off the ferocious roar of the blizzard. Inside the grand foyer, the contrast was staggering. The air was perfectly still, warm, and scented with the gentle fragrance of cedarwood. Julian stood on the heated marble floor, his chest heaving as he caught his breath, his arms still tightly wrapping the frail, shivering body of Maya. Arthur was already waiting, standing ready with a stack of thick, plush fleece blankets that he had hastily pulled from the linen closets. The old assistant didn't say a word, his professional exterior completely masking whatever shock he felt at seeing his normally cold, unbothered employer carrying a soaking wet, freezing child into the pristine house. "Bring her into the sitting room by the main fireplace," Julian commanded, his voice tight with an urgency Arthur had rarely heard in 15 years of service. "And get some warm tea or broth ready. She's severely hypothermic." "Right away, Mr. Vance," Arthur replied, moving with a quiet, efficient speed that belied his age. Julian carried Maya past the towering arches of the grand hallway, his damp boots leaving a trail of melting snow on the immaculate floors. He didn't care. His entire focus was narrowed down to the small, rhythmic trembling against his chest. As he walked into the vast sitting room, the massive stone fireplace was already crackling, throwing a deep, amber glow across the room. He gently laid Maya down onto the oversized velvet sofa closest to the hearth. As he began to carefully wrap the heavy blankets around her, he noticed that her small fingers were still clenched in a tight, iron grip around her mother's thick, worn-out winter coat. Even semi-conscious, her knuckles were white, refusing to let go of the one thing she had risked her life to deliver. "Maya," Julian said softly, kneeling down on the floor so he was at eye level with her. "Maya, can you hear me? You're safe now. You're inside." The little girl stirred beneath the heavy layers of fleece. The intense warmth of the room was beginning to do its work, but as her body started to thaw, the agonizing pain of returning circulation made her wince. She slowly opened her eyes, blinking against the soft light of the fire. She looked around the cavernous room, staring at the high vaulted ceilings, the golden chandeliers, and the massive oil paintings lining the walls. To a child from the working-class lower district, this place didn't look like a house. It looked like a palace from a storybook. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice still rough and raspy from the freezing wind. "You're at my house," Julian said, his voice surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the sharp, commanding tone he used in boardrooms. "My name is Julian. This is Arthur," he added, as the old assistant quietly entered the room carrying a silver tray with a steaming mug of warm sweet tea and a bowl of light broth. Maya looked at Arthur, then back at Julian. Her gaze drifted down to the heavy blanket wrapping her, and panic suddenly flashed across her face. She frantically looked around the sofa until her eyes landed on the adult winter coat resting near her feet. "My mom's coat," she gasped, trying to sit up, her muscles stiff and aching. "Is it wet? Did it get dirty?" Julian gently placed a hand on her shoulder, pressing her softly back into the cushions. "The coat is perfectly fine, Maya. Look, it's completely dry." Arthur put it right next to the fire to keep it warm for her. Hearing those words, the tension practically melted out of the little girl's small frame. She let out a long, shaky sigh, allowing her head to sink back into the plush pillows. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "I promised her I would keep it safe." Arthur stepped forward, kneeling beside the sofa with practiced grace. "Here you are, little one. Drink this slowly. It will help warm you up from the inside." Julian took the mug of warm tea from the tray and blew on it gently before handing it to Maya. Her hands were still trembling so hard that Julian had to steady the mug for her as she took her first small, cautious sips. She swallowed gratefully, the warmth instantly spreading through her chest. As Julian watched her drink, his analytical mind began to process the sheer gravity of the situation. He looked over at Arthur, who was quietly inspecting the child's damp, thin shoes that had been left by the door. "Arthur," Julian murmured, keeping his voice low so as not to frighten Maya. "What do you know about the current situation down at the North Broadway district, specifically the Apex manufacturing plant?" Arthur paused, a look of grave concern crossing his face. "I was listening to the emergency broadcast before you called me, sir." The storm has completely knocked out the main power grid on the lower side of the mountain. Apex Manufacturing suffered a major transformer failure. Apparently, management refused to cancel the night shift despite the weather warnings, and when the power failed, they forced over 200 contract workers to march through the storm to their old, abandoned warehouse facility 2 miles away to finish their quotas using backup generators. Julian's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. As a businessman, he understood efficiency and profit margins, but forcing underpaid manual laborers to march through a historic blizzard because a company didn't want to lose a single night of production wasn't business. It was corporate negligence of the highest order. It was ruthless, short-sighted, and incredibly dangerous. He looked back at Maya, who was now carefully eating small spoons of the warm broth Arthur had provided. Her eating habits were telling. She ate slowly, deliberately, almost as if she were spacing out the food to make it last, her eyes darting around the room with a quiet, watchful caution. It was the look of a child who had already learned the hard way that resources were scarce, and that good things could disappear in an instant. Maya, Julian said quietly, pulling up a leather armchair to sit beside her. Tell me about your mom. What does she do at the factory? Maya set the spoon down, her small hands wrapping around the warm mug of tea for comfort. She works on the assembly line, sir. She makes the small electronic parts for the big computers. She works all night, every night, even when she's tired or her back hurts. And your father? Julian asked gently. Maya looked down at the fleece blanket, her voice dropping to a tiny whisper. My dad passed away 2 years ago, sir. He was sick. Since then, it's just been me and my mom. She tells me every morning that I'm her little warrior, and that as long as we have each other, we have everything we need. Julian felt a strange, unfamiliar tightening in his throat. He had spent his entire life believing that success was an individual achievement, that anyone could pull themselves up if they just worked hard enough. But looking at this little girl, he realized the brutal reality of the world he lived in. Her mother was working hard. She was working herself to the bone in an unforgiving factory during a deadly storm, entirely alone, with no safety net, just to keep a roof over her daughter's head. And the corporate system Julian was so proud of was treating that mother like an easily replaceable cog in a machine. She works so hard, sir, Maya continued, her eyes filling with a fierce pride. That's why I couldn't let her freeze tonight. She always gives me her gloves when my hands are cold, even when her own hands are shaking. I just wanted to take care of her for once. Julian didn't answer for a long moment. He simply sat in the grand, multi-million-dollar room, surrounded by his absolute wealth, feeling a profound sense of emptiness. He had built an empire, yet he had never known a love or a loyalty as fierce and selfless as the one possessed by this shivering 6-year-old girl. Suddenly, Maya's eyes widened as she looked toward the dark windows, the realization of the time striking her. Sir, what time is it? Is my mom's shift over? She's going to come home to our apartment and see that I'm not there. She's going to look for me in the storm. Panic flooded her face again as she tried to throw off the heavy blankets, her small body trembling with a fresh wave of terror. I have to go to the factory. I have to find her before she goes out in the cold. Julian instantly stood up, his large hands gently but firmly holding her shoulders to keep her safe on the sofa. Maya, look at me. Listen to my voice. You cannot go out there. The streets are completely blocked, and the storm is getting worse. If you go out there, you'll get lost again. But my mom, Maya sobbed, tears flowing freely now down her flushed cheeks. She'll be so scared, sir. If she thinks I'm lost in the snow, she won't stop looking for me. She'll freeze. Julian looked at her desperate face, and a decision formed in his mind, a decision that defied every rule of logic, safety, and self-preservation he had ever lived by. He looked up at Arthur, who was watching him with a quiet, knowing expression. Arthur, Julian said, his voice returning to its sharp, absolute corporate authority, but driven by an entirely different purpose now. Get the keys to the armored SUV, the one with the heavy-duty snow tracks and the emergency winch. Arthur's eyebrows shot up. Mr. Vance, the local authorities have banned all travel. The visibility out there is nearly zero. Driving down the mountain into the lower district right now is an immense risk. I don't care about the risk, Arthur, Julian said flatly, standing up and pulling his heavy overcoat back on. We're going down to that factory warehouse. We're going to find Elena Parker before she walks out into that storm. He turned back to Maya, who was staring up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. Julian reached down, picked up her mother's thick, warm winter coat from beside the fire, and folded it carefully over his arm. Stay here with Arthur, Maya. Eat your food and stay warm, Julian told her, his voice steady and reassuring. I'm going to go find your mother, and I promise you, I will bring her here to you. Maya looked at the tall, imposing billionaire, and for the first time that night, a tiny, beautiful smile broke through her exhaustion. Thank you, Julian, she whispered. Julian turned and walked briskly toward the front door, his heart pounding with a strange, foreign energy. For years, he had driven his life toward making money. Tonight, for the first time, he was driving into the storm to save a life. 2 miles down the mountain, inside the rusted, corrugated iron walls of the old backup warehouse for Apex Manufacturing, the atmosphere was suffocatingly bleak. The power outage had plunged the main facility into darkness hours ago, but rather than letting the overnight shift go home to their families, the plant supervisors had marched the workers through the blinding snow to this forgotten, dilapidated structure. Inside, the air was barely warmer than the storm outside. Huge, fuel-burning backup generators rumbled deafeningly in the corners, coughing out thick, acrid diesel fumes that hung like a toxic mist in the air. The emergency lights flickered an unsettling, industrial yellow over the assembly lines. Elena Parker wiped a layer of sweat and grime from her forehead with the back of her sleeve. Her fingers were stiff, aching from hours of handling freezing metallic components without proper insulation. She was wrapped in a thin, faded denim jacket, the only thing she had managed to grab as she rushed out of her apartment to make her shift on time. She had left in such a hurry to ensure she wouldn't be late and risk losing her job that she had completely forgotten her heavy winter coat on the kitchen chair. Every muscle in Elena's body screamed for rest. She had been on her feet for nearly 9 hours, her back throbbing from the repetitive motion of the assembly line. But every time her energy flagged, every time her eyelids grew heavy, she pictured her daughter Maya's sweet face sleeping safely back in their cramped, rented apartment. Just a few more hours, Elena whispered to herself, her breath turning to a pale vapor in the chilly warehouse air. Just a few more hours, and I can go home and make her breakfast. Suddenly, the heavy iron loading doors at the back of the warehouse rattled violently as a frantic figure burst inside, covered head to toe in white snow. It was Sarah, a neighbor from Elena's apartment building who also worked the late-night logistics shift down at the docks. Her face was pale with terror. Sarah looked around wildly until her eyes locked onto Elena. She sprinted across the concrete floor, knocking over a plastic bin of components, her voice cutting straight through the deafening roar of the diesel generators. Elena, thank God you're still here. Sarah gasped, grabbing Elena's trembling arms. Elena's heart instantly dropped into her stomach. A cold dread, far more terrifying than the winter storm, seized her chest. Sarah? What's wrong? Why aren't you at the docks? What happened? It's Maya, Sarah cried, her eyes wide with panic. I went back to the building to grab some extra dry blankets from my place, and I noticed your apartment door was slightly open. Elena, Maya isn't there. The apartment is empty. Elena froze, the metallic part she was holding slipping from her numb fingers and clattering loudly onto the concrete floor. The world seemed to stop spinning. What do you mean she's not there? She was fast asleep when I left. I locked the door. The latch must not have caught in the wind. Sarah shook her head frantically. But that's not the worst of it. The elderly woman on the first floor said she saw a little girl walking out into the street over an hour ago. Elena, she was holding a big adult coat in her arms. She told the lady she had to bring it to her mom at the factory because it was too cold. No, Elena whispered, her voice breaking as the room seemed to tilt. The image of her fragile, 6-year-old daughter wandering completely alone in a historic, zero-visibility blizzard, carrying a heavy coat just to save her from the cold, shattered Elena's soul. Every terrible possibility rushed through her mind. The freezing temperatures, the massive snowdrifts, the invisible traffic, the absolute darkness. Without a single thought for her job, her paycheck, or her own safety, Elena turned and ran toward the exit. "Hey, Parker, where do you think you're going?" A harsh, booming voice echoed from the elevated supervisor's platform. It was Miller, the ruthless night shift manager, holding a clipboard. "Your shift isn't over for another 2 hours. If you walk out that door right now, don't bother coming back on Monday. You're fired." Elena didn't even pause. She didn't look back. Let them fire her. Let them take the job. None of it mattered. Nothing in the entire universe mattered except the survival of her little girl. She slammed her weight against the heavy emergency exit bar and threw herself out into the white void of the storm. The moment she stepped outside, the blizzard hit her with the force of a physical blow. The wind screamed in her ears, tearing the breath right out of her lungs. The snow was so thick it felt like a solid wall, erasing the street, the sidewalk, and the buildings just 5 feet away. The negative-degree temperature pierced through her thin denim jacket instantly, sending an agonizing shudder through her spine. "Maya!" Elena screamed into the wind, her voice completely swallowed by the roaring gale. "Maya, where are you?" She began to run blindly down the North Broadway District Road, her boots sinking knee-deep into the unplowed snow. The cold was a violent monster, clawing at her skin, numbing her face, and making her legs feel like lead. Within minutes, her eyelashes were heavy with ice, and her hands, completely unprotected, turned a dangerous, pale white. She ran to the main gates of the primary Apex facility, pounding her frozen fists against the glass of the security booth. The night guard looked up in surprise, rolling down the window just an inch. "My daughter!" Elena sobbed, her body shaking uncontrollably. "Did you see a little girl here tonight? 6 years old, holding a big winter coat." The guard's face fell, a sudden look of guilt crossing his features. Yeah, I did. About an hour or more ago. She came to the gate asking for you. I told her the power went out and that the workers were moved down street. I told her to keep walking. You told a 6-year-old child to keep walking in a blizzard." Elena shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, agonizing despair. "I thought her house was right around the corner," the guard yelled defensively, closing the window to shut out her cries. Elena fell to her knees in the snow, a low, heartbroken wail tearing from her throat. She looked down the dark, endless mountain road. If Maya had tried to follow his directions, the swirling wind would have completely blinded her. She could have wandered anywhere. She could be lying in a snowdrift right now, sleeping the permanent sleep of the frozen. "Please, God," Elena wept, forcing herself back on her feet with the last ounce of maternal strength she possessed. "Please keep her safe. Take me instead. Just let my baby be okay." She staggered forward, moving up the steep incline of the mountain road, completely against the direction of her apartment. It was pure instinct. She knew her daughter. She knew Maya wouldn't give up easily. If she couldn't find the backup warehouse, she would keep walking, looking for any sign of light. The storm grew more vicious by the second. Elena's vision began to blur, not just from the snow, but from the early stages of hypothermia taking hold of her own brain. Her feet felt heavy like blocks of stone. She stumbled, falling face first into a massive snowdrift. The cold felt strangely warm now, a terrifying symptom that the end was near. She struggled to push herself up, her strength entirely spent. She could barely lift her head. Suddenly, through the blinding white sheets of ice, 2 massive, piercing yellow beams of light cut through the darkness. A heavy, roaring mechanical sound vibrated through the frozen ground. Elena blinked weakly, squinting into the glare. Emerging from the storm like a monstrous savior was a massive, armored SUV, equipped with heavy-duty snow tracks that effortlessly crushed the deep drifts beneath its weight. The vehicle ground to a halt just inches from where Elena lay. The heavy door flew open, and a tall, imposing man in a pristine cashmere overcoat leaped out into the snow. It was Julian Vance. He rushed forward, his powerful frame shielding Elena from the biting wind. He looked down at her shivering, semi-conscious form, his eyes instantly spotting her thin denim jacket. He knew immediately who she was. Elena Parker. Julian shouted over the roar of the wind, dropping to one knee beside her. Elena could barely move her lips. "Maya," she whispered, her voice a dying ember. "My baby. Have you seen my baby?" Julian didn't say a word. A look of intense, profound relief washed over his rugged features. He reached behind him into the vehicle and pulled out the thick, heavy, completely dry adult winter coat that he had promised to protect. He gently wrapped it around Elena's frozen shoulders. "I have her," Julian said, his voice deep, steady, and filled with an absolute certainty that breathed life back into Elena's fading heart. "Maya is safe. She's at my house, waiting for you." The heavy armored vehicle ground to a halt outside the grand entrance of Vance Crest Manor. Julian didn't wait for Arthur to open the doors. He quickly wrapped his arms around Elena, helping her steady her frozen, trembling legs as they stepped onto the heated marble foyer. The moment the heavy front doors closed behind them, sealing out the brutal blizzard, a tiny figure burst from the sitting room. "Mom!" Maya's voice echoed through the high-vaulted ceilings. Elena dropped her knees right there on the marble floor, completely ignoring her aching joints. She threw her arms open, wrapping Maya in a tight, desperate embrace. She held her daughter so tightly, burying her face in Maya's hair, weeping tears of pure, unadulterated relief. "Oh, baby, my sweet girl," Elena sobbed, her voice breaking completely. "I was so scared. Don't ever leave like that again, Maya. Please." Maya clung to her mother's neck, her small hands smoothing over the thick winter coat Julian had wrapped around her mother. "I am sorry, Mom. I got lost. I just wanted to bring you your coat so you wouldn't freeze at the factory." Elena looked down at the heavy, dry jacket she was wearing, then up at Julian, who stood a few feet away, quietly watching the reunion. For the first time in many years, Julian felt a profound warmth spreading through his own chest. He had closed multi-million-dollar deals and built a towering empire, but nothing he had ever achieved compared to the immense value of the scene playing out on his floor. Arthur stepped forward with dry clothes and hot food, quietly guiding Elena and Maya into the warmth of the living room. As they sat by the roaring fire, Elena wrapped in a thick fleece blanket and Maya holding a fresh drawing she had made on a piece of scrap paper, the reality of the night began to settle. Elena looked up at Julian, her eyes filled with immense gratitude, but also a quiet, hard-earned caution. "Mr. Vance, I don't know how to thank you. You risked your life to find me in that storm. But I know who you are. I know you own properties all over the city. Why did you help us? People in your position don't usually notice people like us." Julian walked over to the fire, looking down into the flames. He was silent for a long moment, letting the crackle of the wood fill the space. "Tonight, your daughter taught me a lesson I had forgotten," Julian said softly, his voice devoid of his usual boardroom sharpness. "I spent my whole life building a fortress to keep the world out, believing that true security was found in isolation and wealth. But when Maya stood outside my gate, freezing to death because she refused to wear your coat to keep it clean for you, I realized something. True wealth isn't measured by what you lock inside your vault. It's measured by what you're willing to open your door for when the world turns its back." He turned back to Elena, his expression turning firm and resolute. "I also heard about what happened at Apex Manufacturing tonight. Forcing workers to march through a blizzard because management refused to pause production is unacceptable. Tomorrow, my legal team will be stepping in. You don't have to worry about Miller, and you don't have to worry about that paycheck anymore. I'm opening a new community foundation in the lower district, and I need someone with your resilience and dedication to direct it. The position is yours if you'll accept it." Elena stared at him, her breath catching as a wave of pure relief washed over her features. The crushing weight of survival, the endless anxiety of the overnight shifts, and the constant fear of falling behind vanished in an instant. Mr. Vance, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Julian smiled gently, looking down at Maya. The little girl held up her drawing. It was a simple sketch of a massive house with a large gate, but the gate was thrown wide open. There were 3 figures standing hand in hand inside the warmth. At the top, in uneven, childhood handwriting, Maya had written a single word: home. This story reminds us that true humanity is revealed not in grand, calculated gestures, but in the quiet decision to show compassion when the world would rather walk away. One small act of kindness, a door opened on a freezing night, can completely alter the direction of a struggling family's life. It teaches us that behind every face in the crowd is a profound story we may not see, and that the strongest people are not those who never face hardships, but those who choose to care when it matters most. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to Profound Tales to join our storytelling family. Together, let's remember that goodness always finds its way back home. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, names, events, and situations are entirely fictional and do not represent any actual people or real-world events. The content is intended solely for entertainment and emotional illustration.